Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this short session, which will be 30 minutes. And I'm going to look at an interesting topic that I know, having spoken to a lot of managers about over the last couple of years, is this whole idea of how to give feedback remotely. I think it's fair to say that lots of managers perhaps don't give enough feedback anyway, even if they're working in an office environment. And when I talk about feedback, of course, I'm talking about both positive and constructive feedback. But I think managers often feel reluctant to give feedback when they've got their workforce working from home, because basically, I guess, they're not standing over their shoulder watching what they're doing. So it's very difficult. And I want to give you a few tips today to help you with this whole idea of giving feedback remotely. So welcome. I'll be, of course, sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of the presentation. But let's just launch into the topic today. Now, just a couple of things about me before we get underway. You can see that I'm a keynote speaker. I'm an author. I run workshops. And in my spare time, I play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. So there's a few things about me, but let's move on to the topic as such. Now, I think the big objection that people have when it comes to feedback remotely is it can probably be summed up in this question. How do I get feedback? How do I give feedback remotely when I'm not there to witness what is actually happening? Now, that's a very good question. So obviously you can't see how people are doing whatever it is that you want them to do. And because you can't see them doing that, there might be reluctance on your part to enter into a feedback conversation with that person. However, obviously, people need feedback. We do know from the survey results that employees will often say that they need more feedback. So I'm hoping that two things will happen out of today's short session. I mean, one is that I want to give you some tips, some practical tips on being able to give that feedback remotely. And the second thing I want to do is give you a sense of confidence that that feedback will actually be effective. So let's launch into a couple of different ways of looking at this topic. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about three magic questions that you can ask a person. Now, you might do this via Zoom or Teams or whatever system that you use. And normally, in this case, you'd probably give feedback at the end of a project that had to be done. I'm going to share with you several tips that I think are very useful for giving feedback and things to be mindful of working in a remote environment. I would say, incidentally, that I think that the world of work is really very rapidly moving towards a hybrid working arrangement. I think that this idea of people working from home will continue. And it has been going that way for a long time. But I think what's happened with the coronavirus pandemic, it's actually accelerated that to a certain degree. So I think, managing and leading remotely is an extremely relevant topic moving forward. I don't think this is sort of going to end anytime soon. It may not be the same sort of arrangements as previously, but I think people will be given that opportunity to work from home. And just to finish up, I'd like to offer you a special deal that I've got going today for you attending this presentation. So let's launch into these three questions. What are they? Now, I think this is a very powerful strategy to use because, as I said earlier, obviously you're not sitting there watching people, or you can't just stroll over to their desk and see how they're going. And of course, people will complete their activities and their projects at various times and at home, and they might be doing school homing or homeschooling or whatever it might be. But these are the three key questions. So let's assume, of course, someone's just completed something. So it might be a report, or it could be liaising with a customer, or it could be, having a meeting with their team, whatever it might be. And you've got an opportunity to go online with this person. So we're assuming, of course, this feedback will be done online because it's remote feedback. So you're probably wondering, well, how will I be able to determine what's happened? I can't really say much because I wasn't there. The onus of responsibility in this case is to put it back on the other person. So instead of you actually evaluating a person's performance, ask them these 3 questions. And by asking these 3 questions, which aren't intrusive, they're great questions, you will get the other person to actually basically critique their own performance. So the very first question to ask, as I said before, this would be at a finishing point for some particular task or project that the person's doing. I will ask firstly, what went well? Now, let me explain the rationale by that. Now, even if what happened didn't go well, and it was fairly obvious it didn't go well, by asking the question, what went well, we're starting on a positive. Now, even a project that's been done very poorly, there's always something that's gone well. So that's why we start with that. We start on the positive first. We'll get to the other things in a moment. Now, sometimes the person on the receiving end, if the project didn't go very well, may not have much to say. So you might just have to prompt them a little bit and say, well, okay, what went well? So what was the one thing that actually did go well? Now, by doing that, you're really asking that person to look for some positive in what they did. So it's that's probably the hardest of the 3 questions to ask. So once they've mentioned that, of course, you can ask them perhaps a supplementary question like, well, why did you think it went well? But ultimately, they're now giving you some feedback about their own performance. Now, the second question that you ask at this stage is, what didn't go so well? Now, even if it was a great success, there's always something, as we know, that can be improved, and you're aware of this. So by asking the question, what didn't go so well, you're forcing the person to think critically about their own performance and what they've done. And that's a good thing. So I'd be expecting them to respond to that question regardless of whether it was a success or otherwise. And what we've done with these 2 questions is we've basically created a gap, if you like, between what went well and what didn't go well. Now, my experience is that a lot of people will be super critical of themselves, and sometimes it's not the other way around, where they just gloss over things. So what didn't go well? Now, you don't have to evaluate that because you're asking them to take the onus of responsibility for their own performance. And by doing that, you're going to be far more effective than it would be if you were actually going to give them an appraisal of the work that they've done. And bearing in mind, you couldn't do that anyway remotely. Now, the final question is the key question, because this is where continuous improvement takes place. So what you ask at this stage is, what would you do differently next time? Now, sometimes there isn't a next time. It might be a one-off project, but in a lot of cases, the work that people do is repetitious, so they'll have another chance to do that, whatever it is that they're doing again, and they may well do that remotely. So by asking the question, what would you do differently next time? You're actually asking people to identify what they would do on reflection. Now, they might say to you, well, I probably should have spent a bit more time finding out what the customer wanted, or I should have actually spoken to the stakeholders before I put the plan in place? So often people will give you very insightful answers to that third question. And really, if people are prepared to do something different next time, and by doing something different, they're actually improving their own performance. And because they've committed to doing that, because you've asked them the question, then obviously that's a good thing. And you're probably more likely, ironically, to get that person to improve their performance by them admitting what they could do differently next time, because it's their own information. There's an old saying that people don't argue with their own data. And because people have come up with that suggestion, they're likely to adhere to it. So there's a little tip for you. And I think this works extremely well where there's a very clear start and finish on a task that you've asked somebody to do remotely. So try it out. And of course, it's an after-action review, and it's a very popular approach to use. It's first started out in the military, and now the corporate world's taking that on. Unfortunately, the after-action review has become a quality assurance box-ticking exercise, which is very disappointing. But I think you can still take the gist of it and ask these 3 questions. And by doing that, you can help that person evaluate their own performance. And that's the best you can do, because bear in mind, you're not sitting there, you don't know for sure. And because you don't know for sure, you might feel very reluctant to give feedback. So instead of doing that, why not ask these 3 questions? And you'll find it'll go much better than you probably think. Now, let me give you some other tips of giving feedback to remote team members, because I think there's a range of things that you need to take into account. But the most important, of course, is that you're not sure. You may see the outcome of their work, but you're not sure how they might have arrived at that outcome. So that gives you a clue about some of the tips that I'm going to run through with you right now. Now, the first tip I'd give you is that all you can do when you're, giving feedback on performance when the person's working from home is that you can focus on outputs but not processes. Now, the assumption there is, of course, that people they know what to do. Now, obviously, if they don't know what to do, then they require some coaching from you. But let's assume that they know what they're supposed to be doing, that they have the necessary skill set to do that. Then, of course, the focus for you is very much on outcomes rather than processes, because frankly, you're not sitting there and you can't give any sort of feedback about the processes. So therefore, the only real focus is on the output. And the argument there, of course, is if the output meets your standards, whatever they might be, then it's probably fair to say that that's all that's important. Of course, how they went about it is important, but I mean, if they get the right result, then clearly that's the focus of attention. On the other hand, of course, if they miss the result, then you can ask them what went wrong, or, what did you miss, or what would you do differently, coming back to those questions that I asked before. But I think primarily the focus is on output, not process, and I'm sure you would understand that. Now, a second point about this is extend the amount of time you spend on clarifying goals and priorities. I think when you've got people working from home, I think the emphasis really needs to be on you explaining precisely what you want and when you want it. So what people need when they're working from home is some clarity around their to-do list. So let's say that you want something done by the close of business today. Then, of course, you need to brief people on that early on so that they're clear that they've got something to do. Now, if they've got an objection to that, maybe they've got 10 things they need to do on the day, and what you're proposing is number 11 on the list. If they have an objection to that, or they don't feel confident that they can get it done, then you can talk to them about that. And you might even say to them, well, what are the other things you're working on right now? And they say, well, I've got this and I've got this and I've got this. Then you might then be able to say to them, well, look, as far as I'm concerned, what I'm wanting you to do here is more important than those other things for this reason. So I just want you to concentrate on that. That's the most important thing I want you to concentrate on. So people working from home need absolute clarity around what their priorities and goals are. So if you don't spend enough time doing that, then obviously you're going to be in a position where the person's a bit muddled about what they're supposed to be doing. And of course, you're going to be disappointed in the end, no doubt. So whereas if you're working in an office environment, of course, you can walk past somebody and remind them that this is due in by the close of business today, or it's important to, or you can even ask them what they're working on. It's not so easy, obviously, working remotely. So spend the time up front clarifying what's important, why it's important, and finally get commitment from them that they will attend to what the priority is. So for example, you might say to somebody, we need to get this report done by 5 o'clock this afternoon because the client needs the report. All right, so I've explained what it is, I've explained why we need it. And then I might also then ask them, can I get your commitment to get this done by the close of business today? Now, that's not an aggressive question. It's a very fair and reasonable question. And you want something from the other person, maybe a nod if you're online, or a grunt, or a yes. Now, if you get an affirmative response to that, you have bumped up the odds of getting that done by the close of business today, because they have made a commitment to you because you've asked for it. Often what happens, of course, is we don't ask for that commitment. And that's a problem, because that means that the person is, you think they're committed, but you don't realize, of course, that it's one of 10 things they're working on, and they probably don't see it as a high priority. So they could well disappoint you by 5 o'clock that evening, having not done that report. So ask for a commitment and wait for the response. Now, obviously, if you don't get a commitment, then you have a whole new conversation around why. And it's usually because they've got a whole lot of other things on their plate. So clarify their priorities at that time. The other thing I would suggest that is important when you're working remotely with people is to track what they're doing. So in other words, I might have a check-in with somebody, or all my team, or maybe individually or collectively, it depends on what your arrangement is. But what I might do in the morning, for example, if I've got a Zoom call with someone, I might start by saying, what are you planning to work on today? And then I'm going to listen to what they've got to say. Now, if I feel that those priorities are in sync with my priorities, then all I need to do is say, great, that sounds like we're on the same page. On the other hand, if their priorities are quite different to your priorities, you're in a position now where you can clarify that. Because remember, their view of what's going on is not the same as yours. They've got their head buried up against a whole bunch of tasks. You've got a bit more of an overview of the importance and value of those tasks. So they would appreciate a little bit of wisdom around, well, what will come first, what will come second, and so forth. So I think, of course, you won't know that unless you ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask people, what do you intend to be working on today? And then, of course, you can recalibrate that depending on the response that they give you. And that works extremely well. And of course, people get a sense of, I guess, psychological safety because they know what they should be working on, and they have clarified that with you in the early morning. And of course, you're expecting to see the outcome later that day. As I said earlier, when you're giving feedback remotely, it's very, very hard because you can't see what they're doing. But my suggestion is to get the other person to appraise their own performance. And of course, I've given you 3 great questions to do that. So ask them what went well, what didn't go well, and what would you do differently next time. Now, you only have to do that once or twice, and very, very quickly, your team member is going to understand the importance and relevance of those questions. So you might feel a bit awkward asking those questions up front, but after a while, of course, they're used to you asking those questions. The biggest issue, I think, with feedback is that people often won't take responsibility for their own work. In other words, it's the managerial responsibility. But when people are working remotely, it's fair and reasonable for them to appraise their own performance. The other thing I would suggest is that when you are giving feedback or advice, offer feedback and advice that's easy to implement. Because usually when people are working from home, they're balancing lots of things. They're not only balancing their work, they're balancing their family life. So when you're offering feedback, make sure that it's practical. You know, it's no good, for example, saying to somebody, "Oh, look, I'm really happy with what you're doing." That might be a nice thing to say, but what does it really mean? So be very specific, and also, you know, make sure that you give people feedback that's tangible, that, you know, they can do something with it. And I think that really is very, very important, because you're not sitting there, you're not looking over their shoulder. And because you're not looking over their shoulder or walking past their workstation or whatever, when you do give feedback, make sure, of course, it's very practical and easy to implement. And of course, we're all busy. We've all got plenty of balls in the air we're juggling at once. So the idea is to help people sift through their priorities. Because remember, if they're working in the office and you were approachable and had an open door policy, it would be very easy for them to come and check with you. On the other hand, of course, they could send you an email. They can do that from home. They can do that from work. But I think sometimes email is the worst place to be giving feedback. It's the worst place to be having a conversation. But of course, working from home, it's very convenient, because then I can sort of, you know, virtually cover my backside by sending an email. So don't be afraid to get on the phone and to ring the person. I think it's very, very important to create and maintain trust. And it's a lot harder to do that when you've got people working remotely, for the simple reason that they're not there all the time. They're not picking up all your cues, verbal and non-verbal, and vice versa. So I think, you know, creating and maintaining trust is really important. So I still believe that you should be having conversations with people, what we might call check-ins. And check-ins, I don't like calling them check-ins. I'd like calling them catch-ups. I think check-ins implies that you are there to check up on them. I think if you talk about catch-ups, it's less intrusive. But by having regular catch-ups, what you're doing is you're building trust, you're building understanding, you're building rapport. Now, all of these things are critically important, because we as human beings have a fundamental need to know where we stand. And by having regular catch-ups, you're actually creating a level of trust and safety. So don't be afraid to do that. And I think it's really important to get a system in place. I often say to people when they're working in an office, you should have regular catch-ups with your people, and people will dutifully put aside time, maybe once a fortnight, once a month, where they sit down with the person and just have a general discussion about how things are going. I think that's a very, very good thing to do. But you've got the technology and you've got the medium to be able to do this now. So there's no reason why you shouldn't have these regular, catch-ups online. I prefer them online because you can see the person. They've usually got a camera and you can have a conversation with them about the implications of whatever it is that they're working on. So give that a shot. Okay. The next point I'd make in relation to that is I would probably suggest that you regularly ask for feedback from each of your remote colleagues about yourself. Don't be afraid to do that. I think that, a good manager, or perhaps I might say a good leader, will ask for regular feedback. Now, here's a thought. If you find that you do that and you don't get any feedback, so let's say, for example, you ask Fred or Mary, have you got any feedback from me that might be helpful? And they say, no, not really. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have feedback for you. It just means that perhaps they don't feel comfortable asking for, giving you that feedback, because maybe it's constructive and maybe they might think that you are, that you might not receive it the right way. So try to create a culture where that person or persons working from home is actually giving you feedback. So it's really important to do that because, and of course, again, they're not sitting there in your office. They're not watching you all day. So, but the feedback that you're asking for is probably along the lines of clarity and certainty, what I should be doing, how I should be going about it. Feedback and advice that way, I think, can be very helpful for a leader, because then you can change tack, depending, of course, on what it is. Okay, so folks, those are some tips. I hope that's helpful for you. They're pretty straightforward, but I don't think they always happen. And many of you would be aware that I have a regular, I was going to say catch up, but I have a regular webinar every Friday at this same time. And next Friday, I have another one, which is capitalizing on strengths through job crafting. And I wanted to talk to you about this very interesting topic of job crafting, or what some people might call work crafting. It's an interesting topic. So I've put the link in there, and you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording, and would love to see you next week. And finally, my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment, is out. And I'm offering you a special offer today. And if you'd like to purchase the book, just send me an email and I'll make sure that I get the book out to you for $30 rather than $40. So I'm wanting to give you a special incentive to purchase today. So thanks, Craig, for the feedback. I appreciate that, as always. Hopefully we see you next week. So folks, that's it from me. Have a good rest of the day. And just remember, when you give feedback, some of the tips that I've given you. Thanks, everyone. All the best, and look forward to catching up with you next week. Thank you and goodbye.